Yes, I know. I promised weekly episodes, and, well, I haven't exactly held up my end of the bargain if you insist on going by the traditional definition of week. But hey, a 2 week gap, you have to admit, I am getting better. So I guess you'll have to find it in your heart to forgive me. I mean, you can't stay mad at me while you're so damn excited for the new season of Doctor Who, can you? And I'm also excited, but that is not what I'm going to be talking about on this podcast. And I know what you're probably thinking. You're thinking, well, Tom, the reason you're not talking about the new series of Doctor Who, which starts tomorrow, is because clearly this episode of the podcast was designed to air several weeks ago. And you're right. You're absolutely right. But I mean, what did you want me to do? Just throw out all of the notes that I had drawn up for this podcast? No, you don't want that. What you want is for me to go ahead with the podcast that I had planned, and that is exactly what I am going to do. So this episode will instead largely be given over to my review of a series of 7th Doctor audio plays recently put out by Big Finish Productions. There will, of course, also be a short segment in which I say some stuff about Lost, so if you haven't seen up to, well, I guess last week's episode, Ab Aeterno, then you may not want to listen to that portion of the podcast. And I'm going to round out the podcast by letting you know what you can expect to hear from me over the course of the run of Doctor Who Series 5. So with that, our roadmap laid out before us, let's go. The Cloister Room, with your host, Tom Dickinson. Episode 009, Not About Matt Smith. So what I'm about to review is a series of 5 audio stories centered around the 7th Doctor and a character named Klein. The first is a story from 2001 called Colditz, and the remaining stories are from 2010 from a series of 3 releases called the Klein Trilogy. Now, one of these releases contains 2 stories, and that's why I have a total of 5 stories having to do with Klein. This review is going to contain some spoilers for all of these releases, but I am going to try my best to keep some of the juicier bits out of it and tell you just what you need to know to understand what these stories are about. Colditz is the story of what happens when the 7th Doctor and his companion Ace visit Colditz Castle, a famous Nazi prisoner of war camp, in 1944. Now, the Nazi officers at this camp, one of whom is played by David Tennant, who, as you know, would later go on to play the Doctor in the revived TV show of Doctor Who. Anyhow, these officers find Ace's CD player, and the Doctor fears that if they're able to study the laser technology used by this CD player, the Nazis will gain more advanced military capabilities that could change the course of history. But things get even more complicated when a Nazi officer named Klein arrives. Klein knows about the Doctor, knows about the TARDIS, and even worse, we eventually find out that she comes from the future, a future in which the Nazis won the war. So the story is about uncovering what Klein really wants, why she's come back, and what her plans are for the Doctor. And Klein's a bit of a brilliant villain, and so she clashes with the 7th Doctor, who is himself a very brilliant and manipulative figure. Now, this is a great story. It is definitely recommended. It's cleverly written, and David Tennant is quite good in it. It's an interesting new step for the character of Ace, although I admit that I'm not really sure how this fits in with her arc in the show, because I'm not too terribly familiar with the 7th Doctor era, and I also don't know whether it really fits in with her arc in the other audio plays or the new adventure novels that were published after the classic series ended. So if you are familiar with those areas and you listen to this, you may nitpick that it doesn't make much sense, but it seemed quite interesting to me. But it wasn't the most fascinating thing about this story, because that was Klein. Tracy Childs' performance as Klein really sells the character and the concept, which is an interesting use of time travel. I just can't say enough good things about how cool this character really is. She's a really vicious and mean kind of person, but she's not she's sort of like not all bad. She's sort of not too different from the Doctor. And yes, I am comparing the Doctor to a Nazi, and I realize that that sounds really awful, but I think if you hear this story and hear what Klein is like, and if you're at all familiar with the characterization of the Seventh Doctor, then you'll realize that there's some really interesting comparisons to be made in this story. And I think that's part of the reason for the Klein character's popularity among fans of the Big Finish audio productions, and that's why people have been clamoring for years to have this character return. And finally, it's happened in a series of plays where she acts as the companion to the Doctor. So the first story in the Klein trilogy, A Thousand Tiny Wings, was released this past January. In this story, the Doctor is no longer traveling with Ace, he's traveling alone, but he re-encounters Klein in the 1950s during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. This isn't quite as good as Colditz, but it's still an interesting story. Klein has a bit of a softer edge, which is sort of necessary if she's going to be the companion, but Tracy Childs returns to the role really admirably after 9 years away from the character. I mean, these stories only take maybe a couple of days to record, so Klein is really something she just did for a couple of days in 2001, so the fact that she's able to slip back into it so easily is really quite impressive. The story follows a bunch of British women who are living in the Kenyan jungle, and Klein is one of these women. Some of these women are unfortunately given very little to do in the story, but there are a couple who really sort of shine. And it's an interesting twist. I mean, usually stories of the sort of base under siege type, which this isn't exactly a base under siege, but it's very similar to a Doctor Who base under siege story. Usually those feature predominantly male or mixed gender sort of groups, but all of the people in this quote-unquote base are female, and aside from the Doctor and one other character who is one of the Mau Mau, the entire cast is female. And there's also an interesting monster in this story, and the nature of the monster kind of keeps you guessing till the end, and it provides interesting grounds for some political discussions between the Doctor and Klein. And I mean, they're the kind of discussions you really sort of expect, I guess you'd say. I mean, the whole "we're not so different, you and I" thing that you often get from villains talking to the hero in a story like this. But the fact that the hero is the Doctor and the villain is a Nazi sort of adds an extra edge to this kind of conversation, especially because as the listener to the play, you really sort of believe that it's true. But anyhow, that's the first release in the Klein trilogy. The second release is another 4-part story, only the first part is its own thing called Klein's Story, and parts 2, 3, and 4 on the CD are a 3-part story called Survival of the Fittest. Now, A Thousand Tiny Wings was good, but it wasn't excellent. Klein's Story is excellent. In this story, we learn a bit more about Klein's origins, expanding on what we had learned in Colditz. This takes place directly after the events of A Thousand Tiny Wings, and the Doctor asks Klein to tell him about her origins. Now, at first I was worried that this would just be a rehash of exposition we'd already gotten in Colditz, and at the beginning, that's basically what this story is, but there is something more subtle going on here that makes it into an excellent story. We learn more background about Klein's life in her alternate future, and that gives us a bit more emotional investment in the character, and this really changes our understanding of her and continues the softening of her character in the view of the audience. Now, on the one hand, this diminishes what made her such a great villain in Colditz, but that, as I said, is necessary to make her a companion. Because of this story, we now know that she has a real, concrete reason for wanting to go back to her timeline, and I'm not going to tell you what that is, but I am going to tell you it's more than just the glory of the Nazi Party. And she also gets a more concrete reason for hating the Doctor, even more than she already did. But again, to say too much more on that topic would be giving a lot away. Suffice it to say that if you've already heard Colditz, you probably have an idea of what I mean. But in any case, the other story on this release, Survival of the Fittest, is another very good story. It's really interesting in its concept, and the fact that it's 3 parts instead of 4 ensures that it's going to move along at a good clip with minimal padding. Now, as I mentioned, the previous story ended on a bitter note, with the Doctor about to take Klein on her first TARDIS journey, but Klein having learned some things that have given her a very bitter attitude towards the Doctor. Now, as this story begins, it's clear that some time has passed, and the Doctor and Klein have begun to build up a bit of a, well, I hesitate to say affection, or even trust, but at the very least they've built a rapport. This story involves the Doctor and Klein meeting and befriending a species of insect called the Vril. Now the Vril are threatened by some sort of nebulous danger, but because they communicate via a scent-based language, there are some issues with the TARDIS translation, and the nature of the threat isn't exactly clear at first. But once we find out what it is, well, let's just say it leads to some more interesting allegory about fascism. Of course, I don't think I'd be spoiling too much if I gave away the fact that this story ends on a cliffhanger when we find out that Klein isn't exactly as buddy-buddy with the Doctor as she appears to be, leading into the final story, The Architects of History. Now, this is one story where I really don't want to say too much at all for fear that I might give something important away, but I will say that it takes the premise of Colditz and expands it to an epic scale. It's really mad and confusing and personal, and it's a story about Klein's struggle to regain the world that she lost. The story also introduces well, again, let's not spoil it, but it's quite the interesting role for Lenora Critchlow, who you might remember from the 2007 Doctor Who episode Gridlock, or you might know from her starring role on BBC Three's Being Human. And while the ending of this story is a bit too, I guess I'd say, rosy, the rest of the story is very dark and deep, so as a whole, The Architects of History might be the best of the lot, so it forms a very satisfying conclusion. So on the whole, is it worth shelling out the cash to download these 4 releases? Well, I certainly thought so, although it is quite a bit of money. But if you're not sold on them because you don't know too much about Big Finish or the Seventh Doctor, and you want to give them a try before you commit, I suggest downloading Colditz. Obviously, it stands on its own, and it's available from BigFinish.com for a dramatically reduced price. Or at least it was. It was supposed to be until March 31st, but even though it's April 2nd as I record it, it still seems to be available for cheap. So maybe if you rush, you can get it quite cheaply. Even if not, it's still well worth a listen at the regular price, and if that leaves you hungry for more, then give the Klein trilogy a whirl. Okay, that was a bit of a long review segment, so that means Tom says some stuff about Lost is going to have to be slightly abbreviated. But you should just skip it entirely if you haven't seen the episode Ab Eterno from 2 weeks ago. Seriously, if you want to avoid one of the biggest Lost spoilers there is, then you should stop listening now. But feel free to rejoin us just after the 15-minute mark. Okay, still here? Well, now we know. The island is a cork. More precisely, it is the cork in the metaphorical bottle that contains all of the world's evil. And without the island, all of that evil would be loosed onto the world at large. Now, this is huge. If this is true, then we now know what's really been at stake for the entire 5.5 seasons of Lost that we've seen. But like every answer Lost has ever given us, it only raises more questions. Now, that's not a problem for me because it doesn't just raise more questions, it allows us to ask better questions. So that's why right now I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of the revelation that the island is a cork. So I think it's safe for us to assume that the smoke monster, aka the Men in Black, is the physical manifestation of the evil that the island is trying to contain, at least according to Jacob. Maybe I'm wrong, because some of the things the Man in Black has said has led us to believe that he was once human, but at the very least I'd say that he's very closely tied to the evil that the island is attempting to contain. But one of the big questions is, if Jacob is telling the truth, then why is it that, in the Flash Sideways timeline, the island has been apparently destroyed, or at the very least sunk to the bottom of the ocean, but it certainly doesn't seem that evil has taken over the world. In fact, it seems like the world is a little bit better than it is in the main timeline. Okay, maybe not a lot better, but it does seem very slightly better. But then again, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we still don't really understand the narrative significance of these Flash Sideways, or what they really mean, what their relationship is to the main story, so I guess we're going to have to reserve judgment on that for now. The other implication I was wondering about has to do with the island's electromagnetic pockets. Now, I wonder whether the electromagnetic pockets on the island are a manifestation of the evil it's trying to contain, or a manifestation of the energy of the island that is acting as a cork containing that evil. And because the Dharma Initiative was messing with that electromagnetic energy, it becomes a little bit easier to see why they were a threat to the island and ended up having to be removed via a violent purge. Although we still don't really know who ordered the purge. It could have been Jacob, it could have been Richard, it could have been Ben, or, in my opinion, the most likely one, it could have been Charles Whitmore. But in any case, those are just a couple brief considerations on the meaning of the whole cork thing, and I'm sure there's a lot more to be said on the topic. It's just that it's not going to be said right now. So that's about all the stuff I have to say on Lost. So that pretty much wraps it up for this episode of The Cloister Room, but I do want to let you know a little bit about what's going to be going on during the run of Series 5. Now, I'm not going to be reviewing each episode here on the podcast, because despite the rather lengthy review segment on Big Finish this week, I never conceived of The Cloister Room as a podcast that would do a lot of reviews, especially not reviews of current episodes of the TV show, seeing as there are a zillion other podcasts where you can get just that and probably get it done better than I could do. But do not fret, because every week you can still get a detailed review from me. It just won't be an audio review in a podcast. It will be a text review, which you can read on the excellent blog Behind the Sofa, run by the gentlemen from the podcast Tachyon TV, who post their own reviews there and kindly allow contributors to post their thoughts as well, and I happen to be one of those contributors. So every week I'll be reviewing an episode and it'll show up over on Behind the Sofa, but I still intend to do weekly or almost weekly episodes of this podcast, and many of these episodes will relate to the content of the concurrent Doctor Who episode. It just won't be a review, strictly speaking. It might be some initial reactions or just some commentary on a specific aspect of the episode that I didn't want to go too in-depth on my review, but I felt merited a long and terribly windbaggish discussion here on this very podcast. So you'll have that, you'll have my weekly, or, well, almost weekly thoughts on Lost, if I can think of things to say about it. And you know what, I think I'm also going to talk a little bit about Ashes to Ashes, which is entering its third and final series starting today, Friday the 2nd. So, yeah, you can expect to hear some stuff about that as well. And as always, I reserve the right to surprise you with something completely out of the blue, not related to Doctor Who or anything else I've ever talked about on this podcast, and I guess I also reserve the right to go on hiatuses of several weeks long without any notice and without any justification, because, well, I'm still a university student and I still have exams and things like that. So anyway, no Dune quote this week and no haiku review, but actually, you know what? Here's what I'm going to do. I've been watching a bunch of classic Doctor Who stories over the past week, and I'm going to give you just straight-up star reviews of each one with no explanation as to why, just for the hell of it. Frontier in Space, 3.5 stars. Planet of the Daleks, 2.5 stars. Remembrance of the Daleks, 4 3/4 stars. Pyramids of Mars, 4 stars. Robots of Death, 4 stars. So yeah, with that impulsive series of star reviews, I hereby draw this episode of The Cloister Room to a close. This is Tom Dickinson, 2 Eyes, No E's, signing off. The Cloister Room is a fan-made production not associated with the BBC or ABC or anyone involved in the production of Doctor Who or Lost or anything but this very podcast, because of course I am associated with myself. If you can't associate with yourself, then who can you associate with?